Okay, it's live, but we're not starting. Mic is hot.
So don't say weird things.
Or do say weird things. That would be
There you go. We're gonna do sound check.
Well, this is great. We asked some candidates the other day, have you ever taken any bribes?
Go ahead, please. Test 1, 2.
Test 1, 2, mic check 1, 2. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Test 1, 2, 3.
Testing, testing, testing.
Thanks, guys.
starting in 2 minutes.
You guys look color coordinated almost. And we match our chairs.
Yes, that's what I was.
Good.
I know it just got real quiet. We do have a couple minutes before we start.
Can we talk?
We should do monologues.
We're actually investigating all of you. That's what the pregnant pause was for.
Could be good. Do we use Patty's? Try to go behind you here. And then Patti, before Ben hands you the mic, we're just going to do a clean start with you. So we'll just give a few seconds pause, and then we're going to start the recording when we send out. Yep.
All right, aloha everyone. Mahalo for being here. I know we've got some folks still coming in, but try and grab a seat. Welcome to Civil Beat's new office here at 3650 YLI. It's great to have you all here, and it's great to see a full house for this very special conversation. My name is Ben Nishimoto. I'm the Vice President of Operations and Philanthropy here at Civil Beat. I'm just going to get right into it so I can hand the mic over to Patti. Today's hour-long conversation is going to be featuring Dean Baquet, the former executive editor of the New York Times and the current executive editor of their Local Investigations Fellowship. To his right, I've got Blaze Lovell. He's a Civil Beat reporter who transitioned to a Local Investigations Fellow, part of the very first cohort that the New York Times put forth. He is now back with Civil Beat as a Civil Beat reporter, but during his time, as you folks know, he wrote about loopholes in Hawaii's pay-to-play laws as part of a fairly expansive investigation that spanned his entire fellowship year. Moderating today's discussion is going to be Civil Beat's editor and general manager, Patti Epler. So round of applause for all three before we start. So just a few quick housekeeping items before I hand this over to Patti. Bathrooms are out the door to your right. Let's see, validation, if you have parked in our building and have not yet received validation, reach out to Ashley or anyone else in a Civil Beat shirt, and they'll direct you to get it validated. It's basically 2 hours of free validation, which spans this event. Please put your phones on silent. We will be recording and we are currently live streaming this event, so just as a heads up. And then finally, we are going to take questions from our online audience, but we also love to take questions from you folks as well. So we've got these note cards and pens. We're not going to have an open mic, so if you have a question, write it on the note card, raise it up high, and someone with a Civil Beat shirt will come around and grab them, and we'll send them to Patti here. Okay? So thank you all for coming. Again, great to see you all here in our offices. Mahalo for the support. And here's Patti.
All right, we're good to go. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces as well as some new folks. So that's really cool. And of course, we always really appreciate you all coming to our events and trying to help us build this community of civil discussion around issues that are really important to us. And this is for sure one of them today. So I'm super duper thrilled to be introducing Dean, who's really a legend in my world, but I'll just expand a little bit on what Ben said so y'all have a better idea. But Dean is, of course, the former executive editor of the New York Times, who kind of sort of retired maybe in 2022, I believe, but not really, because he went right into leading this new local investigative fellowship program. He's had a very long and distinguished career in journalism, newspapers in particular. And besides many various jobs at the New York Times, Dean has been the editor of the Los Angeles Times and was also a reporter for the Chicago Tribune and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. He's won his own Pulitzer for investigative reporting in Chicago for stories documenting corruption on the Chicago City Council. And of course, he's had a hand in leading, directing, editing countless Pulitzers, as well as many, many other local, regional, national awards for the work he's done. And so not only Chicago and New York, but I believe Dean is from Louisiana.
I am.
Which is a very interesting place to be from, especially if you're interested in the kinds of things we're going to be talking about today. And so I hope we get to hear a lot more about your life and times as we go along. So welcome, Dean. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And then to Blaze. So, Blaze has been with Civil Beat here since 2017. He grew up on Oahu, Pearl City, I believe, to be exact. Pearl City. Yeah. And then went off to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he got a degree in journalism and played a bunch of rugby. And he still plays rugby. And we know that because he comes in all the time taped up and banged up and doing weird exercises against the wall that I guess he's trying to straighten himself out. But he's been here since 2017 as an intern, and he's stuck with us the whole time, which is great, and has always pretty much gravitated toward government, politics, accountability, journalism, ethics reporting. He's been a key player for us at the legislature and the state capitol. Lately, he's been turning a more investigative eye toward the Native Hawaiian community and some issues and institutions there. But last year, as you've heard, he was selected to participate in the first inaugural cohort of the Times' Local Investigations Fellowship. So that took him away from us for a year, although he did sit in the office most of the time, but we couldn't make him write stories or anything. So that was a drag. But it put him directly to work for Dean, and that's been super helpful. He did a couple of really great stories in that year, data-driven investigative pieces, one on the Maui fires and Maui County's accountability, lack of accountability. More recently, as you know, he did the pay-to-play on the contracting and the contractors' donations. And so we'll hear a lot more about that as we go along today. But first, I'd kind of like to just start off with Dean by talking to us a little bit about the Local Investigative Fellowship Program and how it's going now, what you guys hope to accomplish with that, and how you came to choose Blaze way out here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
So thank you. First of all, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. So when I stepped down as editor of the New York Times, the New York Times has a rule that I was editor for 8 years, and you step down at 65. I lasted till 66. And as I was about to leave, I got into a conversation with the publisher, and I grew up in local news. I grew up in New Orleans. I started out at an afternoon paper in New Orleans and worked for a morning paper, worked with the Tribune, was a reporter for the New York Times. And I think that local journalism is in a crisis. And I actually think that crisis is contributing toward some of the national dysfunction we're seeing now. I think that local journalism is the most trusted journalism as a rule. And as local newsrooms get hollowed out and cut, I just think it's just really harder for people to connect to each other with a sense of community. And I also think it's hard. I mean, when people ask me what the press did well or didn't do well over the years, I thought that one reason the 2016 election results were such a surprise is I don't think that we had a handle on the country the way we have in the past. And I think part of that is that so many local newsrooms have been cut. So for me to be able to work, the way the program works is we get hundreds of applications from around the country, from local journalists who are either freelancers or who work with news organizations like this one, and they pitch an idea. And if we're drawn to the idea, we pay the salary of the reporter. They become New York Times reporters for a year. Frankly, Blaze was one of the most impressive of the applicants, to be honest. When we went through the hundreds, his idea was terrific. I found him in the conversations I had with him, just, he had such knowledge of the place, having grown up here, but he just knew so much stuff. And frankly, I think Civil Beat is exactly the kind of news organization we want to help and support. And it was, frankly, he was a no-brainer, to be honest, in picking him. I mean it. It was like, and he proved that to be true. I mean, he was just really thoughtful and had a great idea about how to pursue it. So that's how the program works. And we have, at any given point, 10 or 12 reporters all around the country. They stay in their local communities. Wisconsin, we have one in California, we have one now in Utah. I'm going to forget. But mainly the goal is to work with reporters in places that are not in New York, that are not necessarily in Los Angeles, that are in places where, frankly, there's not as much reporting. And the goal is to give a local reporter the time to work on a story. It's hard. If it's one of the things that when I grew up in journalism, newsrooms had 300 or 400 people. And you could take, when I worked at the Chicago Tribune, it was a 600-person newsroom. And I pitched an idea that took a year, and that was sort of easy. If you think the project wasn't easy, getting the time was easy. And I think if you have I work with newsrooms now that have 20 people. It's hard to take a year if you have a newsroom with 20 people. And it's hard to take the risk. And great investigative reporting is a risk because you don't actually know what you're going to find. And you have to be open-minded about it. And you start with the germ of an idea. Nobody comes to us and says, if you give me a year, I'm going to do a 4-part series. It's going to say A, B, C, and D. What we try to offer is, in addition to some training for reporters, we also we embrace the risk. Frankly, Blaze has worked out beautifully. Not all of them have worked out as well, but that's okay, because that's the goal, is to give people a chance to spend time and take a risk on a project.
Great. So Blaze, maybe tell us a little bit more about what you did and the work that you accomplished. And just to follow up on what Dean said, we actually have 14 reporters in this newsroom, not 20, and not 600. So,
No, but hardly anybody has 600 anymore, just for the record.
But having Blaze detached for a year was a bit of a commitment for us. But at any rate, tell us all about what you did and what you learned and how it's helped Hawaii. And
yeah, I mean, frankly, I was actually kind of surprised that the Times would pick, a kid from the middle of the Pacific Ocean to, go and work for them for a year. I didn't think that I was actually going to get it for, a long time, and was, pleasantly surprised when Dean and the folks chose me for the fellowship. And the fellows and I talked about this in the past year, and we were saying that the greatest resource that Times was able to give us was that time to actually be able to work on these projects that we had going on, because it's such a time intensive thing, going through all of the data that we had to go through and spending time calling dozens and dozens of people every week, not knowing if you'd get an interview. And sometimes that that does happen. You run down your list and nobody picks up the phone, people slam the door in your face, stuff like that, reporting stuff. Like dipping in without knowing that there's going to be a payout at the end was like a really big risk. I'm glad that it paid off for us, and I was worried for a long time that it wouldn't. But the first story, we were working on, to back up, in 2022, there's those two former legislators, Ty Cullen and Jay Kaleni English. They got, indicted for bribery, admitted to taking bribes from Milton Choi. So one of the first things we wanted to do was look into all the different, the tentacles of this Milton Choi case. And one thing that we settled on was to start looking at Maui's, how they oversee their procurement system, and how this whole scandal there with their wastewater department, how it all happened. Like, what was the system in place that allowed that to happen? What failed? And we had that going on before the Lahaina fire. And if I remember, we were almost ready to we were getting really close to publishing it. And then August 8th happened, and we kind of had to, it did two things. It changed the story, obviously, because it was already about Maui, and now everything is about Maui. So it gave us a sense of urgency, a new sense of urgency of why looking at this procurement system was important. But it also meant that we had to go and try to get a handle on what Maui's spending on their contracts, at that time. And so we came out with that in October. This newest story, I guess, the big pay to play article that published in April, we were sort of rolling on that all year, trying to go through the data. And Hawaii's data is really easy to access, but the condition of it is really crappy. And so we spent many hours and afternoons trying to manually match the names of donors. I don't know how many times I had to rewrite the name Arm Towel to make sure that it was matched every other instance of Arm Towel. And trying to nail down these anecdotes that we had in the story and make sure that everything was in tip-top shape to get ready and go.
That was, by the way, just for the record, one of the I dropped out of college, so I became a reporter at 19 in New Orleans. And when I did quote unquote data journalism before there was an internet, I had to do everything by hand. I would hate to find out how much I got wrong, but I once did a project about zoning in Chicago, and I literally had notebooks and note cards and wrote down every zoning change, did my own analysis. There was no way to computerize it. And I thought, working with Blaze and this group that the Times is contracted with called Big Local, which is a group of journalists and frankly data engineers at Stanford University, and they joined up with us. And watching this develop over time, I thought, my God, I want to go back and be a reporter again, because we were able to, Blaze's description of cleaning up the documents is right, but we were able to tell a story with the kind of precision that journalism didn't allow when I was a reporter. It was a lot more seat of the pants. So I think that's sort of, it's easy for people to talk about what's wrong with modern journalism, but I will say that for my money, the internet has been bad for the business of journalism, but great for the precision and accuracy of journalism.
Yeah, besides the great reporting resources that the Times gave to all the fellows, we were able to talk to a lot of the New York Times reporters and pick their brains and sort of really understand the nuts and bolts of how they approach stories and approach projects. But they also partnered us with these great data journalists. I had Eric Segarra and Eden Casado Sanchez, and they're they're like total wizards with websites and with data. Eric was able to scrape things I never imagined we'd be able to get. And, they also taught me a ton about, data analysis and, using coding to analyze things faster and do it better and get it more accurate. And, those are some of the biggest skills that came out of the program with.
So talk a little bit more about what data you actually did use, Blaze. I think people are used to, say, campaign finance reports, but what else did you bring into it?
Yeah, so the current campaign finance database, I think, has 220 something thousand entries. So we started with that. When we're talking about cleaning, that's like what we really had to clean, because those entries in it all come from are all self-reported from the campaigns. And so, along the way, there's incorrect spellings introduced, and, names spelled, 5 different ways, 70 different ways. And so that's where a bulk of the cleaning work had to do. And with all, like, even though there's all these programs that can help optimize it and make it a little quicker, it ultimately came down to us just sort of manually going line by line and making sure that a lot of it, well, not like line by every line, but going through a good chunk of it manually to make sure that it was, all matching up. And we needed to do that because we had to make sure it matched, our list of contractors that we also had to get, which is also a gigantic pain because of how disaggregated the state is. The state has its own contracting database, which, according to the state, is incomplete. Yeah.
And so, Dean, how does that compare to other places you've worked? Do they have, as Blaze said, crappy data too? Or
Yes. I had a couple thoughts as we worked on the sorry, first I realized I've worked as a reporter in the 2 states or cities that are sort of regarded as the most corrupt and patronage driven, Louisiana and Chicago. When I tell people, there's usually a chuckle when I'm in journalism groups and I say, and the fact that I won a Pulitzer Prize for investigating corruption in Chicago, people mostly laugh. That's like, that must have been pretty easy, like shooting fish in a barrel. And sort of was. I think that there are, and I would love to hear whether people agree with this. I came away from Blaze's project thinking there were similarities. And, states and cities that don't want you to know stuff don't work very hard to make the information available. They make it hard. Not only for journalists, by the way, but for everybody. They just don't want to be that transparent. Chicago was that way. Certainly, Louisiana was that way. When I wrote about corruption in Louisiana, it was like it was such a. I mean, for anybody who's read the history of Louisiana and knows about the Longs, it was such an accepted part of the culture of the place that there were 2 problems. First, finding stuff out wasn't that hard. Having impact was really difficult because people were so used to, and I think there's a similarity here. People in Louisiana were, when I was an investigative reporter for the Times-Picayune, I was invited to be one of the questioners at a gubernatorial debate. And I don't know if people recall Edwin Edwards. Edwin Edwards was the most colorful Southern politician of his era. He was governor for 8 years, sat out, and came back for another 4 years. And I repeat this all the time because I want to make sure it's in my obituary. I was in the back of the campaign bus with Edwards, just the 2 of us, when I got what I still think is one of the great inappropriate political quotations of all time. It's just the 2 of us. A poll has just come out. He's got like 65% of the vote. And I say to him, any way you lose, right off the top of his head, he says, the only way I lose this election, a heavy Cajun accent, which I won't try to do. Any way I lose this election is if I'm caught in bed with a dead girl or a live boy, which is now one of the great political quotations. I want to make sure if something happens to me, that's in my obituary. So here's what may be similar to Hawaii. So I'm one of the questioners of on a debate with Edwards during the same campaign. And I had just done a story sort of similar to Blaze's, but much more rudimentary. It was about the sheer number of people who gave him money who had gotten contracts during his previous stint as government and had gotten jobs in the government. So I asked him, I said, so, Governor, 70% of the people who have given you money have state contracts. How do you explain that? He said, there are three kinds of people who want state business: qualified friends, unqualified friends, and enemies. I'm working my way down and I'm still on the first group. So that was the culture of Louisiana. But I suspect there's some of that here. I suspect that sort of indifference, which frankly puts a lot of pressure on journalists to not only continue to dig, but to figure out ways to get communities to connect to those stories, understand them. And it's hard. And it shouldn't be just be the province of journalists to do it. It should be for the readers too, to take it in, think about it, and think about ways to change.
So as you're explaining, journalists and the public have been dealing with this kind of political corruption for decades. I guess one thing I'd want to know is, was there anything that was particularly surprising about what you guys uncovered in the Hawaii that we could learn from here? So,
you want to go? Okay, the lead of the story that Blaze wrote is as blatant an act of political favoritism I've seen in years of reporting. Why don't you describe the lead, the party?
Yeah, I mean that lead anecdote. So one of the primary cases that we looked into were these political parties that were being thrown by a high-ranking airport official at the time. Where politicians would come in. He'd provide the venue. Did sometimes pay for the food. Sometimes he'd pay for the food, and they'd invite these lobbyists. They'd invite executives with various companies, and they'd invite people who had work at the airport or were pursuing work at the airport. And all these individuals, to get in, you had to make a campaign donation to whoever the beneficiary, of the fundraiser was that night. And I think in the moment when I was reporting it, I was sort of like, oh, well, whatever. I feel like I hear that every other week, and was sort of numb to it until the folks at the Times are like, what the hell is happening in Hawaii? And yeah, I read the story again the other night, and I sort of shocked myself all over again of how kind of ridiculous, that whole episode was. But to Dean's point about impact, I do sometimes wonder how much, of what we write about pay to play and about political corruption actually resonates within the broader community. I mean, obviously all you folks care because you're sitting here right now listening to us talk about it. But, in the far reaches of the state, I sometimes wonder if those people are caring or not.
So what about that, Dean? You've seen this for a long time now. What kind of impact? I mean, it does seem like this just goes on and on and on, and we write stories, and it kind of, no one here in Hawaii at least says a word about it. It's very hard to get a reaction from the political leadership here. What do you think? I mean, how do you know if you're having an impact, or how do you have more of an impact?
I think that first off, you can't be discouraged as journalists when you don't have a lot of impact. You just have to keep plowing away, because if you get sometimes the impact you have is relative to the culture of the place you're covering. I remember being on a panel with when I was at the Chicago Tribune with a guy who was an investigative reporter for the Minneapolis paper. And Minneapolis is such a good goo-goo kind of place that anything they wrote, there was a commission and people got fired. And I remember being startled because anything we wrote, people sort of ignored. I think you can't give up. I think you have to keep a story alive. Within, I'm not saying make stuff up, but once you sort of write the big story, I think you have to find ways to do two things. First off, this is a new phenomenon, having readers and supporters come in to talk about a story. I think that's one of the great, frankly, creations of modern journalism. We used to write stuff and never talk to readers about it. So I think this is terrific, and this is a big start. But I think the other thing is you keep the story alive, you keep writing. You maybe use if a newspaper has a strong columnist or editorial board, you keep it alive that way. You don't give up. You get out in the community, make sure people know about the story, make sure the story is read. I'm not arguing for being advocates, and I don't think Blaze should, start giving speeches about changing Hawaii. But I think that it's helpful to just do events like this. And then I think probably the other thing is to figure out ways. There's a new movement now, which I did not understand when I was a reporter a long time ago. There's a new movement in the realm of solutions journalism, where you really sort of reach in and find places that have grappled with it and fixed it. And you try to sort of go out, find those places, write about them, show people what the possibilities are. And then the other thing is, I think you have to show the impact on people's lives. You can do when I was a reporter at the Times, we did a series of stories about bad water meter contracts, and that were driven by patronage. And the guy who owned the water meter company eventually was accused of a crime. But it was showing people, here's how this affects your pocketbook. I think working really hard to show that corruption, patronage, pay to play are not just intellectual phenomena that you can sort of chuckle at, that it actually affects your life. I think we have to work much harder than we have in the past to say, here's why it's important. Here's why it affects your taxes. Here's why it affects, traffic in your community. Here's why it affects how long you have to wait at an airport. And I think that's part of it. It's look for the ways to bring stories about patronage home to people so that they see, oh, this isn't just a funny story about politicians. This is why I'm waiting in line at the airport.
I think that's really good advice for us in particular. And hopefully Blaze will be doing more stories that are coming directly out of the work that you did with the data. I hope we don't let that slip.
Yeah, more to come.
Yeah, good. I'm going to kind of switch here a little bit to some of the audience questions and probably combine a couple here because some of them are similar. But one thing that someone is pointing out that's interesting, that I find interesting too, is that here in Hawaii, it seems that change only comes when the federal government gets involved. And there are, many endless corruption investigations here that the feds are doing. The guys that Blaze mentioned, the two lawmakers, that was a federal investigation. Milton Choi was federal. So I don't know if that's something, Dean, that you've seen elsewhere, that states are reluctant. And someone else is sort of pointing out too that because Hawaii's agencies are often threatened with budget cuts when they're investigated, that it kind of is maybe makes sense that they don't want to really rock the boat or poke someone. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, on how we really get a handle maybe on the enforcement of corruption?
Yeah, I think you have to be careful to not depend too much on the federal government, because it sort of, frankly, U.S. attorneys come and go. Sometimes you get, I was in Chicago for a crusading U.S. attorney, and then followed by a less crusading U.S. attorney. So I think you also don't want to align yourself with investigators, because part of being independent is you want to be able to write stories that say the investigators aren't doing enough, right? So you want to keep a little bit of a distance. I'm in favor of keeping a little bit of a distance from all government. But maybe we should write more stories where we question the federal government's role. Maybe we should write stories that say, go call the last 5 U.S. attorneys and say, hey, what did you do? What investigations did you come up with? What did you? Sometimes they don't get covered enough, so I would aggressively cover them. And back in the solutions journalism realm, I would like. It's a good story to say, why is it nobody's job to make sure? And in fact, Blaze has touched on this. Why is it nobody's job to make sure the stuff doesn't get policed and fixed? That's a good story too.
So that actually reminds me of something that's not in my script here, but early on when y'all first started working with Blaze, if you'll recall, we received a document, or well, we actually unredacted a document that the U.S. Attorney's Office had filed. And they had just mistakenly not done it correctly. So you can pop it into a Word program and it'll just, the redactions will appear. And it was, I believe it was what they called the downward departure memo, which was explaining in some respects why I think it was Ty Cullen, got a little bit lighter sentence. So we all talked with our attorneys, Dean, Blaze, Scott on the phone, and tried to figure out what do we do with this, because the U.S. Attorney was basically freaking out and didn't want us to publish this court record. So Civil Beat came down a little bit on the side of, okay, we want to be part of the community. We don't want to blow your investigation. So for a while, and it's been more than a year, so the while is running out, we'll hold off on that. We won't do it. But what did you think of that, Dean? I never really thought how you thought of that.
If you don't mind my saying, I might slightly disagree. I understood, and we're not part of any community in a weird way, the New York Times. My rule has always been, we publish. Prove to me that somebody's going to get hurt, killed, or otherwise we publish. So I probably would have published, but I understood the decision, and my view was that was Civil Beat's decision to make, not ours, sitting in, I'm sitting in Manhattan making a decision about, but I probably would have published. And I've encountered that in the past in Washington and locally. When I was in New Orleans, you wouldn't have. I get the argument not to have, and I'll give you examples of where we did and we didn't. I would have, only because I don't think it's our job, and I say this as it's a respectful disagreement, because you all are in the community and I'm not. I don't think it's our job to help law enforcement with their investigations. And I think every time I can think of a lot of examples. Every time I've done that, whether it's in Washington or elsewhere, I've sort of regretted it later. Unless somebody says, there's a guy walking around with a wire, and if you report this story, somebody's going to shoot him in the head. That's different. Then it's like, but otherwise, I don't think it's our job to help government protect their investigations.
I totally agree with you on that. This, I think, was the first time that I've ever come down on the side of this. But I don't know. Civil Beat's a local news organization.
I completely get it.
And so, but like I said, we agreed we would hold off for a time. The time is running out, especially with the elections coming up. And if there's anything that we can learn from this document, that would help inform people about other folks that are running for office now, we'll do it. We're still kind of trying to track things down on that, right, Blaze? So yeah. So but at any rate, I just thought that was,
and again, I just want to say, I do understand. This is one of the the things about our program. I don't think that I should, sitting in my, at my desk in New York, make those kinds of decisions for you all. This is a world you have to live in. I'm just describing what I would have done if I was the local editor.
A little bit along those lines, another member of our audience wants to know that it's hard to escape the sense that sometimes reporters get a little dazzled by the proximity to people in power, and doesn't that sometimes stifle their impulse to run stories that are unflattering to these same people who give them privilege and access? Blaze,
no, because I'm never dazzled.
What you mean? Donovan Dela Cruz hasn't like gotten to you a little bit? No.
I mean, no, so, the way I approach.
This is why we picked Blaze for our program. We were dazzled.
Yes. So the way I approach sources, politicians, state officials, I recognize that the relationship is I need something out of them, they want something out of me, but there's a professional boundary, I think, that we all need to put between that, where you're not going to do them favors, you're not going to, you're not their friend, right? There's this unspoken, sometimes it is spoken, agreement that you're there to share, information because it helps you do your job, but it's not to like help them, and help their own purposes and causes. Ultimately, our duty is to the public.
I had a rule. I was in one of my many iterations. I was the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times for about 6 years, and my rule was, and many people disagreed with this. My rule was I never wanted to have an off-the-record conversation with a politician as the bureau chief, which meant, I was there for the latter end of the Bush White House and the beginning or a big chunk of the Obama White House. And President Obama would often have off-the-record breakfasts and lunches with bureau chiefs. I never went. Because my view, and I took us out of the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the Gridiron. I ended the New York Times going to all those things. My rule was I don't want to know anything that I can't tell you. So I don't want to sit down with, whether it's President Bush or President Obama, off the record, schmoozing and walk away knowing stuff I can't tell the reader. Because to me, that defeats the whole purpose of being a journalist, which is I'm your representative. And my job is to tell you stuff, find stuff out. And I think that in Washington is especially really, frankly, awful at this, where there's like this off the record. That's why I absolutely hated the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It made me sick to sit there. And the one time I went as bureau chief, I just walked away thinking, my God, why am I sitting here pretending that we don't have we have a necessarily tense relationship with government? And I didn't want to participate in this ritual where we all pat each other on the back and say we're all on the same team, because we're not all on the same team.
I think that's really a good point, and it's often hard here in the islands to kind of the saying here is the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, or don't talk stink about your friends. And so it is a little difficult when you're in a small space like this and people are afraid of kind of speaking up and whatnot. So it is a little bit different, but not too much. A reader is asking now that Kalani English is already out of prison, and so is, I think, Ty Cullen. They've both been released. What now with those guys? Is there anything new with that, or are we looking into that at all? What more are we doing for corruption investigations generally, I suppose, would be a question.
Sure. I mean, without disclosing too much unpublished material, we're doing a lot of following up on all of the public corruption investigations that came up in recent years, and the extended tendrils that off from those cases, including the redacted memo that Patti mentioned. So we've got a lot of things cooking. I can promise you that.
I guess one thing too is you guys spent a year going through these really detailed records. You had the help of the big local data journalism folks. So a lot of time, how about people who are just trying to decide who to vote for? What can they do that can kind of help them understand a little bit better about who their politicians are, what their records are?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the information that journalists use, it's all accessible to the public predominantly. So like candidates are required to file financial disclosures. And those are all up on the Ethics Commission's website already, and we've been coming over those, and you can do that too. Campaign finance reports, those are all public. The next report comes out July 11th. And so you can see who's donating to candidates and, which organizations, which sorts of people are supporting who you're going to be voting for. I think those are the two top things. I mean, I know for me, those are the two top things I use in my reporting, and I'm sure the average citizen could use them too.
The only thing I will add is, this, I can't, for somebody like me who grew up in the afternoon newspaper era, which Blaze probably wasn't even born when there were afternoon newspaper. I think that there's this new thing. You can resurface stories. You couldn't do that in the print era, right? You're like, you would do your big story in January, election was in November, and the most you could do is throw in a paragraph or two. I actually think we should figure out ways, journalists, to repackage, resurface stories. And I think we have to understand that not everybody read the first versions of stories. And I think that we need to, like, I'm no longer editor of the New York Times, but I hope the Times, for instance, when it gets closer to the election, will you could almost create a magazine online for each candidate where you sort of take the best of the stories, update them, include data, and really do something more substantial that you could not do in the print era. Because in the print era, maybe you could do a reprint or an insert, but that's not the same thing. I think we have a lot more keys to play on the piano than we did in the print era, and I think we should keep constantly looking for ways to play them.
What's your view on sort of a little bit more advocacy journalism? I know the New York Times has been struggling with this a bit in recent years, but should we actually take an active role in, I don't know, or be more trying to point out, hey, this person is really reform-minded, this person is not, what do you think about that?
I think we can say, the New York Times is not an activist news organization. I will say, it's really interesting to reading the discussions now over activist journalism, and there's always been terrific activist journalism in America. That's not a new thing, right? Anybody who knows about I.F. Stone, The Nation at its peak, those are all activists. Those were all terrific high activist news organizations with high standards. They were just different from what the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I think what you all aspire to do. But I do think that it's okay to make judgments and say, at one point during the presidential election, we ran, a list of during the 2016 election, all of the insults that Donald Trump had leveled at his opponents. The Washington Post ran a recurring fact check of essentially all the lies that Donald Trump said. I don't think that's advocacy. I think that's within the realm of truth telling. I think it's a little bit different. Advocacy is more, if you put on the equivalent of your front page, this guy should resign and here's why. I think that's a little bit different. I do think that should be the province of the opinion side of the house, if there's an opinion side of the house. My own view is that the more of an advocate, purely advocacy journalism institution you are, the less people will buy it when you get something big. We got Donald Trump's taxes. And 2 years before that, we did probably the deepest analysis of how Donald Trump actually wasn't really wealthy, and he's wealthy, but didn't make his own money. I think my view is, I respect the nation. If the nation had done those stories, people wouldn't have quite bought it. They would have thought, well, they have a point of view, a very powerful point of view. They actually wouldn't have gotten the documents probably too, because I think the people who wanted to help us because we were seen as an institution with broader appeal. So I think you have to ask yourself the question, if the New York Times or Civil Beats or the Washington Post gets a big get, like what Blaze did or Donald Trump's taxes, I think people are more likely to believe it coming from a traditional news organization. And that's why I think it's important to hold on to that independence, frankly.
You're okay?
Ditto.
Let's see, we have 10 more minutes or so here, but one of the things that is surfacing in these questions from the audience, and I know I feel, is a little bit of a frustration with how things just never change. And I know we've kind of talked about this, but one person is asking, do you, Blaze, think reform is more likely now than it was in the 1990s? I guess you were born then, right? And so, yeah.
Yeah, when I was born. I mean, I like I was saying earlier, I sometimes have a hard time gauging how much of an impact this is having in a broader community, and especially, among politicians who are actually going to have to decide on what changes, if any, there should be. We've reported that this is something that the judiciary chairs and the legislature want to take up. The Campaign Spending Commission is obviously interested. The State Ethics Commission has it permanently on their agenda, every month that they meet now. So I think, there's the rumblings of it, but we'll actually see what happens, in 2024 when the legislature convenes. I mean, there's a bunch of promises made in 2022 after the bribery cases came out, and there wasn't a whole lot out of that Foley Commission that ultimately got passed. There was a good deal of it that did, and for the reform-minded crowd, I think there were some really good some bills that they thought were good that passed, but not all of it got through. So we'll sort of have to wait and see, I think.
I don't think journalists have the luxury of giving up, frankly, or becoming frustrated. I just don't think as I've said before, I've worked places where people shrugged. I just don't think we have that luxury. We have a job, we have a mission, we have a constitutional amendment that defines that mission. And I don't think we can get away with being frustrated. I think if you pound away and there's no impact, you sit down and say, okay, what's our next step? I just think that our job is to ask those hard questions and to not of course it can be personally frustrating, but I think it's our gig is to ask those hard questions and keep at it and not throw up our hands. And because that frankly has happened at many news organizations. It's easy to happen, right? It's easy for a news organization to say, oh, come on, let's just give up. That's not the job, the job is you keep pounding away.
So what would you tell one of your reporters or several of your reporters who are, say, for instance, trying constantly to get Maui County government to sit down and talk about what has happened during the fires, to release a report that just came out, a federal ATF report that the county will not release. And then, our staff calls them incessantly and no answer or no response or whatever. So what would your advice be? And the other thing I guess I want to know is there anything the public can do about that? I mean, they get tired of hearing us, but is there anything that regular folks can do?
On the first point, I'd write a story that says what you just said. X months after, and if you did that, do it again. X months after this report that laid out X, Y, and Z that has not been made public, here's what we think is in it. Here's the stakes for it not being made public. It means people who live here will not know X, Y, and Z. Write that story. Frankly, I don't think it's advocacy. If Civil Beat wanted to put a little box on its page every couple weeks, 1 week since this very important report has not been made public, 2 weeks since this very important report has not been made public, 3 weeks, it's like Ted Koppel with the release of the hostages. I don't think that's advocacy journalism. That is a public document that you have the right to know about. And I think, I just writing about it, sometimes we internalize our frustration. We should write stories about it. I would just write a story, write a box every week, 1 week 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and one of two things will happen. They'll either release it, or readers will start to see, as long as the story makes clear the stakes and what we as taxpayers are not finding out because we don't know what's in that report. I would just like keep at it.
We'd have so many boxes on our homepage. No one would be able to find
Nothing
stories.
but boxes.
Yeah, but no, I think that is a great idea. We'll maybe try something like that. Let's see. So I think maybe we're probably down to the final few minutes here. Oh, yep, there we are. And so I guess, one thing I wanted to kind of ask you, Dean, a little bit is that, we're very committed to local journalism here at Civil Beat and in the islands. And so, we're very super grateful to you for picking Blaze and helping him. And I think his work has had good impact because it's not news till it's on the front page of the New York Times, so so I think that was great. But what's next for local journalism and the New York Times, and in particular, what other plans might you guys have to help Hawaii out?
On the local plans for we've picked our next group of fellows. We've announced them, and they're from all over the country. And there are people like Blaze who have the question I always ask, because we get tons of applications, because, for the year, the reporters are on the New York Times payroll. They're reporters for the New York Times. So we get tons of applications. The question I always ask in reviewing an application, I don't expect them to be fully baked. I'm not looking I want to help reporters shape their projects. And also, I don't know the communities until I get involved in the stories. And I don't think, sitting in New York or LA or wherever I am, trying to decide what the most important story is the thing to do. So we try to pick. The question I always ask is, could this story be done without our resources? And the answer is no. Those are the fellows we pick. I think we want to stay engaged with Hawaii. Not only will Big Local continue to work with Blaze, I hope to continue to have conversations with you and Blaze and others about keeping the story alive. I do think that you all have an opportunity at Civil Beat that the New York Times doesn't have, frankly, which is not only, we're doing this, there's no financial gain. In fact, there's financial cost for the New York Times. The goal in this is we have sort of begun to turn a corner in terms of getting past the dramatic changes in journalism to survive. But I think we have an obligation to local news organizations like this one and local communities to help. So I was telling Patti, I haven't slept in my own bed for about 6 or 7 weeks because I've been traveling all over the country visiting local news organizations. So that's part of it. I would love to help Civil Beat and others invent new ways to tell stories. I do think that in a weird kind of way, we are still caught in the transition between the print era and the digital era. I sometimes still think that our stories still are print stories transferred to digital stories, and I'd like to keep figuring out ways. I learn more from you all, frankly, than you all may learn from me. How do we do that? How do we, like the box thing is something would have been harder to do in the print era, but how do we tell stories in ways? How do we engage with readers in ways that, like this, frankly, that help me as a senior editor of the New York Times, would also help this organization connect with readers? How do we reinvent storytelling? Because I think that's going to be, how do we come up with ways to tell stories that grab people by the lapels? How do we move to a new phase of storytelling? And I would love to work with you all and all the other news organizations we work with to do that. And it's not going to be easy, but I still think we're like just have a toe, maybe a foot in the water on how to tell stories in a new era. And I think we got to get better at that. And I'd love to work with you all and Wisconsin Watch and the other news organizations I work with to figure out how to do that, because sadly, print's going to go away one day. It's already like slowly dying. And I think we got to figure, it's actually quickly dying. I think we got to figure out ways to tell stories differently. And I would like to not only work with you all to do it, but then steal ideas from you all and bring them to Wisconsin Watch and bring them to some of the other news organizations we're working with.
We would definitely love that. That would be so awesome if we worked that out. That would be great. So
Great.
yeah. Can you top that, Blaze? Should we just wrap it up? Yeah.
Well,
Did you have something to say?
actually, I was curious if you asked them the New York Times apartment question that you said you'd ask all of us.
You mean that crazy question of would you stay in which apartment would you stay in?
No, it was like you came, you had like an 11-hour flight or train ride.
Oh, God.
And you arrive in New York and it's raining. And you go to the Times apartment and the bed's not made, so it looks like someone's in there. Do you go to sleep or not?
This is a question we used to always ask. When I was a reporter for the Times has a cluster of not very nice apartments in the Times is in Times Square, as you can imagine. Not very nice apartments nearby, like tiny corporate apartments that are always a little dirty. And the test I always made is, would you arrive cold night, New York, it's 11 o'clock, midnight, you show up at the Times apartment, you get the key from the doorman, you go in, and the bed's unmade and it's dirty. The question I would always ask, do you stay? Do you leave? And it was always interesting how many people, the first time I did that as a reporter a lot, and I would go in, bed would be unmade, I was exhausted, and I would say, oh my God. I'd either sleep on the couch or hold my nose and sleep in the unmade bed. One reporter, Adam Nagurney, is a political reporter, always said, I would just get in the bed. I figured it had been a colleague who'd stayed there anyway. So, but the first time I went with my wife, I walked in, opened the door, stepped in. We were living in Washington or someplace. I looked, it was a mess, towels all over the place. I shrugged. I kept going, door closed behind me. I realized my wife didn't even come in. And I opened the door and looked back in the hall. She said, no way. We're going to go find a hotel. So.
What did you do, Blaze?
My answer, my room was clean in reality, but my answer to Dean's question was I'd just go to sleep.
All right. Well, that is great. And
Thank you all.
Thank
really,
you
really
very
appreciate
much.
it.
Thank all of you.